There's no question about it that right now the labor market is slowing down. If you look at the number of job offers, it's growing less dynamically than it was the case. If you look at the length of the unemployment spell, meaning how much time it usually takes people to find jobs, those who are unemployed, this has increased. So I'm not surprised that people are slightly more concerned, but I think we should have a more balanced narrative. It's not a disaster. It's more of a slowdown.
Welcome to the Warsaw Wire, a podcast about Poland's economy, business and energy. Surveys in Poland show that more and more people believe that unemployment is about to rise. Many workers feel it is becoming harder to find a job. And yet, when economists look closely at the data, they see something very different. One of the strongest labor markets in modern Polish history. I'm Alicja Ptak, a deputy editor-in-chief at Notes from Poland, and today I am joined by Piotr Lewandowski, a labor economist and the president of the board at the Institute for Structural Research in Warsaw, who will help us understand Poland's labor market paradox. Piotr, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation. Hi.
Let me start with a personal observation. For the past year or so, every month, when Statistics Poland GUS released new unemployment figures in Poland showing a rise in unemployment rate, we saw a flood of alarmist headlines in the Polish press. And every month, at the Notes from Poland, we had to decide whether it is actually a major story that we need to cover. And what confused me when looking at this data was that some of it seemed to point at different directions at the same time. So the unemployment rate was rising, but also the employment was rising at the same time. So let me start with the big question. How is it possible?
Because economy is not uniform. Some sectors are growing, while in the other sectors there's less good news. But most importantly, in the last few months, the growth in unemployment in Poland was essentially confined to the so-called registered unemployment rate. So let's start with the basics. There are two main measures of unemployment. One of them is the number of people who are registered in labor offices, in public employment services, and they are registered as unemployed. And the other main measure is based on surveys where people are actually ask about whether they're jobless, whether they are willing to take up employment, and whether they actively search for jobs. Because to be unemployed, according to the, let's say, standard definitions, you need to be jobless, you need to be willing to take employment, you need to be actively searching. But the registered measure doesn't really ask these questions. And last summer, Poland has changed the rules that pertain to not really registering, that is how it has been for years, but the rules pertaining to when the offices can remove somebody from the registry have changed. So in the past, if somebody was registered, was offered a job but didn't take employment, then that person was removed from the registry. Now it's not the case. People have the right to remove a job offer, say, okay, I don't really agree with that one. It doesn't really fit my skills, or it's too far. And they have this right now that they remain in the unemployment registry. They can use the search assistance that they offer, and they will be suggested another job offer in the future, probably. But they remain in the registry. So obviously, the number of people who are deregistered, the outflow from the registered unemployment stock, this has declined. Since the outflow has declined, even if the number of people who lose jobs and show up to the office and registered as a newly unemployed person, if that remains the same, but just essentially less people are deregistered, then the stock will increase. So for a couple of months, it was really unclear whether the increase in the registered unemployment in Poland is driven by these definition changes and by the legal changes pertaining to who can remain a registered unemployed person in the office, or whether it was really a sign of the deteriorating labor market conditions. Right now, we can also compare the evolution of this registered unemployment rate, which has increased, to the evolution of a survey-based unemployment rate and the total number of people who are unemployed according to the labor force survey conducted in Poland every quarter. And the survey-based measure of unemployment doesn't really show any increase. And the first quarter this year is more or less the same as it was a year ago. So this measure of unemployment is flat. So overall, that suggests that an increase in the registered unemployment that many people have been concerned about, and that was sort of like, made the headlines, that this increase in the registered unemployment rate was largely driven by the fact that the rules of how the offices register and deregister these people have changed, rather than the actual change in the labor market conditions that are behind these changes. Yeah.
So why are media in Poland so focused on that one headline figure of registered unemployment?
Yeah, that's bizarre. In a sense, I think that it's kind of psychological, and the reasons for that go more than 20 years in the past. In the late 90s, early 2000s, essentially until Poland joined the EU in 2004, Poland was a high unemployment country. And the nationwide unemployment rate was over 20%. In the period between 2001 and 2004, among youth, it was well over 40%. So unemployment was a really traumatic experience of entire generation. And one of the most, let's say, contested aspects of the economic transitions from the centrally planned economy to market economy was the labor market deterioration and the growth of unemployment. Since we joined the EU in 2004, the labor market situation has improved dramatically, and unemployment has gradually declined and has become actually quite low. But I think that this inheritance from the trauma of the high unemployment era has essentially defined the public debate on employment outcomes and labor market in Poland, where every government wants to boast that the unemployment rate under their reign is very, very low, and so on. This debate hasn't really modernized, because if you compare the focus paid to unemployment rate in Poland as compared to other labor market indicators like employment growth, earnings growth, and so on, we're very much preoccupied with unemployment. Whereas if you let's say read how the labor market developments in the US or in Western European countries are reported, then much more attention will be paid to job creation, earnings dynamics, and things like that. So it's sort of like more productive in that sense. It's more about employability rather than unemployment per se. But it's very hard to change, because that narrative kind of replicates year after year and media after media.
So, if I understand correctly, you're suggesting that part of the reason why so many Poles right now are afraid that the unemployment rate is going to increase in the next 12 months is rooted in some kind of a national trauma that came from the transition period, right?
Yes, well, there are signs that the labor market is slowing down. So after the pandemic, there was a period of pretty robust employment growth and earnings growth, even though we had a very high inflation, which has undermined living standards. The earnings by now have essentially rebounded, even in real terms. So there's no question about it that right now the labor market is slowing down. If you look at the number of job offers, it's growing less dynamically than it was the case. If you look at the length of the unemployment spell, meaning how much time it usually takes people to find jobs, those who are unemployed, this has increased. That means that once you become unemployed, it's probably a little bit harder to find jobs than it was the case a year or 2 years ago. So there's no doubt about it, the fact that it's slowing down. And certain sectors, especially in manufacturing, but as well as in tradable services, which employ more skilled people, these sectors which were growing quite strongly in Poland, like furniture industry, which Poland is a big producer, construction, but also automotive. These sectors are maybe not in a crisis, but they kind of flatten out. So there's no doubt about it that the picture on the labor market is less rosy. It's not really bad, but it's definitely less rosy than it was the case a year or 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm not surprised that people are slightly more concerned, but I think we should have a more balanced narrative. It's not a disaster. It's more of a slowdown. And I think there is also a lot of uncertainty that people are not really sure how the situation will evolve. Also regarding jobs that are more exposed to new technologies with AI and so on. So I would call it a slowdown and more uncertainty on the labor market rather than a crisis right now.
So, and who feels this slowdown most strongly, in your opinion?
Many manufacturing sectors definitely feel that. As I mentioned, some of the Polish exports are pretty well diversified. We don't really have dominant industries which drive the export and economic growth, but there will be sectors which used to employ many workers, and maybe they are not shrinking yet, but they definitely stopped growing. Automotive is shrinking, so it's well beyond the peak, and that was a sector that employed a lot of people. This entire, construction supplies, furniture, and so on. This kind of manufacturing, which is labor intensive, so employs quite a large number of people. It has also probably peaked some time ago. So I think that part of this concern is related to the fact that sectors which were creating a lot of jobs offered good wages and rising wages, that these sectors are not really offering the same opportunities as it was the case. And also in services, Poland has been a big supplier of tradable services. So that's more like a corporate sector, business process outsourcing, and so on, which is employing about 500,000 people or more. And that sector is also slowing down, partly because wages in Poland have increased. So all that kind of FDI, where Western companies are moving jobs to Poland because it's cheaper, it's not happening that much as it was the case. While many of these industries kind of struggle to understand or to find a new niche where they could grow.
And across the sectors of the economy, but looking more at the people, what kind of person would right now struggle the most with finding a new job or a first job?
It's kind of hard to tell, to be honest. I mean, obviously, education plays a big role, meaning a positive role. So usually it's a gateway to finding better employment, and it's always and it's still the case. Even though there are signs that some of the jobs which are more exposed to AI or more exposed to new technologies, like in IT, which has been a very vibrant sector in Poland, but it's not really expanding as much as it was the case in the last few years. So it's hard to tell. It's hard to say that it's just like one profile of people who are struggling a bit more right now, because it's a little bit heterogeneous. We see that there is a slowdown in manufacturing. There are manufacturing closures in certain cities, like in Łódź and so on. But also there will be a service sector in cities like Krakow, let's say, which is struggling, which is a very different type of jobs than the manufacturing jobs. But again, you can see that to some extent it's maybe mean reversion, meaning that these are the sectors like the service sector, that they were growing very fast. And I think to some extent they overinvested, and kind of like everybody assumed that their growth will continue and continue and continue. But it's hard to run faster. At some point, you have to slow down. So it's not really a uniform picture, I would say, in terms of where we see these pockets of a more challenging labor market conditions.
I want to return to one thing that you already mentioned, AI, because I feel that in the current day and age, it is impossible to talk about work without mentioning AI. And I must admit that while looking through Goose data on job creation and distraction, one thing surprised me. It was that sectors that are often discussed as being most vulnerable to AI, such as administration, education, parts of the IT sector, did not perform particularly badly. Meanwhile, manufacturing that you already mentioned, which is often seen as relatively safe source of employment, recorded some of the slowest growths in new job creation. And I wonder, does this challenge some of the common assumptions that we have, that we hear about AI and the future of work? What do you think?
It's definitely too early to have a very evidence-based or research-driven assessment of labor market impacts of AI, because the actual adoption of these technologies in the work is relatively low. So what we have is more speculative or more expectation-based assessments, which look at which jobs are exposed, rather than using data, rather than studies that use data on the actual implementation of AI in the workplace and the impacts on workers. That's one thing. There is evidence for the US, let's say, that the jobs which are occupations which are more exposed to AI, job creations, especially at the entry level position, is probably lower than it was the case. So, but again, it doesn't mean that this will remain as such in the short or even medium term, because firms may be quite enthusiastic about the possibilities of replacing workers with AI. But whether these investments will actually pay off and whether this will actually turn into a lasting organizational change that reduces labor intensity across various industries, it's too early to tell. It could be the case that some of these firms will realize that it's not that easy to replace so many workers with AI, and then this hiring will increase in the future. In Poland, the labor market picture or outlook is, again, slightly more complicated to assess these impacts as compared to, let's say, US or Germany, because we have two parallel trends. One is the adoption of these new technologies and how they change the demand for labor and demand for skills. But the other trend is a more of a secular transformation of the labor market, meaning agriculture that is gradually declining, manufacturing that is also gradually shrinking in terms of employment, because as compared to countries like Germany or Italy even, meaning Italian manufacturing, Poland used to have a quite labor-intensive manufacturing. The number of robots per thousand of workers, the capital per worker is relatively low as compared to Western European countries. As manufacturing modernizes, it becomes more similar to manufacturing in Western European countries. This labor intensity declines. So there's new technology, which is not necessarily AI. It's more like traditional industrial robots, let's say. And that this will reduce the labor intensity in manufacturing. As Poland is moving, let's say, up the value chain from more like simple tasks into more technologically advanced manufacturing, this will also reduce labor intensity of production. Let's say if we look at automotive sector, if we grow electric cars and electromobility, the labor intensity of producing these cars is much lower than traditional combustion cars. So there is a range of developments which are happening that translate into declining labor demand in these more traditional sectors, which employ workers performing mostly manual physical tasks, At the same time, these trends increase the demand for skills in these sectors. So the fact that we see declining employment in agriculture or in manufacturing, it isn't necessarily a bad thing. So sometimes it indicates that some firms are struggling and people are becoming jobless. But in other cases, it just essentially suggests or shows that firms are becoming more modern and they reduce labor, they increase productivity by becoming more efficient, let's say, and needing fewer workers. At the same time, there is the demographic context. The demographic context and population aging in Poland, these two forces have been reducing the supply of workers over the last 10 years or so. And especially when it comes to workers who are willing to perform the sort of like middle skill jobs in manufacturing, many companies have faced worker shortages. The situation here changed quite a lot, because I remember 10 or 8 years ago, the discussion with manufacturing was mostly about they struggle to find workers, they need more migrants, and so on. I guess that some of these firms facing this persistent recruitment struggle, let's say, or persistent worker shortages, they also invest in technology that will reduce the need for workers in the future. So in consequence, they will become more efficient, have a higher productivity, but the need for labor will be lower. They will need fewer workers with more skills, let's say.
The data that I mentioned on the job creation also showed that one of the fastest growing areas of employment in Poland recently, last year, actually has been public administration, especially security and defense. And I wonder, what does that tell us about the direction of the Polish economy?
When it comes to defense and public security, let's say, you can clearly relate that to the increased military spending and the fact that the entire Europe is paying more attention to defense. But it's a part of a broader trend. If you look at the longer 10-year span, you will also see that even in simple clerical jobs, simple clerical jobs, like from accounting through secretaries to call center type of occupations. In most European countries, in most EU countries, the employment in these kind of jobs has been declining for the last 20 or 30 years. And Poland is a kind of an exception here. So total employment in these jobs has increased over the last 10 years by about 300,000 people. And there are three sectors which drive that. One is retail, which I think, can be related to e-commerce and the fact that every supermarket these days needs to offer online sales and deliveries. So you probably need more workers to accommodate this e-commerce in every type of company, essentially. The other sector which has been growing in terms of these clerical jobs is manufacturing, which is probably the same and maybe more, bureaucratic burden like ESG and whatever, where you need to have workers who will ensure compliance with all of that. But it's also public administration there. So public administration has also been hiring across different types of offices, which is not defense or security, but essentially your municipal office, voivodeship office, and so on, which I think is purely political economy in that sense that is just like government is hiring more people, because every time you can offer jobs, which are safe jobs, locally, then maybe you're if you win local election, you just hire more people and people like you. So at the same time, wage dynamics and earning growth in the public sector has been relatively low, and even right now there is debate that maybe they should strike or whatever. So what we're seeing in the public sector more broadly is increasing employment with lagging wages, like the gap between earnings in the public sector and in the administration and in the private sector. This has widened. So it's like the employment models in the private and public sectors in Poland are diverging. Like private sector is increasingly about maybe lower employment efficiency and earning growth, while public sector becomes sort of like a security, higher employment, but not great perspective for earning growth.
I'd like to return to the job shortages and the demographic challenges that Poland is facing and AI, because I wonder if all of these things that we often cite as risks to Poland's job market, so mainly the demographic decline, the aging population, etc. And as you mentioned, a lot of manufacturers have been calling the government to allow more migration to make up for those losses. What do you make of the prospects for the Poland's labor market in the future when you have those opposite forces colliding?
It's undoubtedly a huge challenge, meaning that Poland's labor force will be shrinking. It will also become older. That will also change the structure of skills. In the past 20 or 30 years, Poland has achieved incredible growth, also in terms of human capital, largely because there were numerous cohorts of educated people entering the labor market. But right now, the demographic structure is as such that these inflows, even if you invest a lot in education, and even if these kids are well educated, there are just not that many of them. So in terms of replacing the workers who are reaching the retirement age, the number of entrants are just much lower. And even if they are better educated, it's still just like not enough. And at the same, so if you look at the Polish Ministry of Labor has announced that list of occupations that they define as occupations that face worker shortage. And if you take that list and if you look at the employment numbers right now, and you try to assess, so what share of the existing labor market is defined as jobs that face worker shortage, that's about 25% of the total labor market. And these occupations are essentially across the board, except for clerical jobs and except for farming. So it's essentially across the skill distribution. At the same time, the Polish government right now is making a concerted effort to reduce immigration. They slashed the number of work visas that Poland issues, and they're proud about it. And finally, the Polish Ministry of Labor also tries to do a pilot of a 4-day work week. So it spends like 50 million zlotys on this pilot, where some companies, many of them actually public sector, are about to test whether we can reduce work week to 4 days per week, and everything's going to be fine. It just doesn't add up overall. So you can either say that 25% of the labor market are occupations where we will lack workers, and that will face worker shortages that may constrain their ability to perform what they are about to perform, or you can reduce work week, or you can reduce immigration. Because having essentially, it's like a belief that in a magical way, in a very short period of time, the labor productivity will grow a lot. Because the only way to deal with these labor shortages without attracting more workers is to increase the productivity a lot. So to be able to produce the same type of thing or deliver the same services with the lower number of people and a lower number of workers. But you can maybe do that in manufacturing quite easily if you invest a lot in automation. You can maybe do it in some service sectors if AI works very, very well. But it's much more challenging to do that in healthcare or in public transport. You can't just tell train drivers just to run the trains faster. And on top of that, if you really want to increase labor productivity a lot to compensate for this declining supply of labor and introduce new technologies, quite often you need more skills for that. So it's quite unlikely that this scenario will pan out very well if there is no investment in these new skills, which are required to utilize the new technologies more productively. So overall, it's a very bizarre situation, because I think that the debate on restricting migration is purely political, and it kind of contradicts the government's narrative about Poland's aiming to be a economically vibrant country. Because it's hard to become a 20th biggest economy if you at the same time are shrinking in terms of the labor force, and if you don't really think about the fact that to compensate for this declining supply of labor, we need more skills and more technology. Right now, there is no strategy, essentially, to increase the skills or to bring more skilled people and say, okay, we just want to have highly skilled migrants who suddenly, for some reason, might prefer Poland rather than Canada or the US. But if you really want to do that, to say, we want fewer migrants, we don't really need more Uber drivers, but we want to have more skilled people, you need a very proactive policy to achieve that. Just saying that we're done with attracting low-skilled workers is not enough to suddenly attract high-skilled workers. So I think that this paradox is unresolved completely, and that labor shortages will become a constraint on Poland's growth soon. Right now, the debate is mainly driven by more manufacturing or agricultural sectors, where, for instance, in manufacturing, which have higher labor intensity, they struggle to find workers, so they're very vocal about the need to increase migration. But I think in the time frame of like 10 years from now, our biggest shortage will be among high-skilled workers. Because if Poland wants to move up the ladder in terms of global value chains, but also in labor productivity, it's about increasing the skill intensity of work. And then the skill shortages will become even more important over time.
So it sounds like you are saying that what government is doing right now is actually exacerbating the problems that the Polish labor market has. So if current trends continue, what will Poland's labor market look like in 10 years, in your opinion?
Yeah, we estimate that the shortage of skilled workers will be a substantial challenge. I think the shortage of skilled workers, both in professional and technical occupations, can be in 10 years from now about 500,000 people. So that this entire debate on startups and so on and so on and so on, it's kind of an illusion, because if you really want to grow these sectors, you need to have talent and skilled workers. While it's going to be increasingly challenging because of the demographic dynamics, the fact that the number of people entering labor market will just not be high enough. At the same time, population aging will increase the demand for workers in certain sectors which are not that flashy. We will need more workers in healthcare. We will need more workers in elderly care. So these are the sectors which are quite tedious, which don't really pay that well, especially care. We're not talking about health here, but more like care. So these are the sectors where these are hard jobs, and they don't really pay very well. So many countries in Western Europe deal with that, with essentially creating programs for migrants to work in these sectors. And right now, I think it's a little bit of an illusion in Poland that we can deal with population aging without following the same path, because I don't really think that thousands of Poles will suddenly, quit their jobs to take care of their elderly parents. And the final challenge is of a structural mismatch. So it is quite possible that the risk that I see, and I think is the biggest structural risk for the Polish labor market, is that some of these sectors, like in manufacturing or the shared service sectors, business process outsourcing, which have been quite vibrant in the last few years, they employed many workers who were middle to high skilled, but not very high skilled, and performed more routine jobs. If these sectors wind down, these workers may struggle to move to these very high skilled jobs because they will need upskilling or reskilling, which is challenging. So I think the structural challenge related to the fact that some of the sectors are past their peak and will wind down, while the sectors that we would like to grow probably require very different skills. This will be a structural challenge for the next 10 years or so.
Piotr, thank you very much for your insight. And thank you to our listeners. If you like this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe. And see you next time.
Thank you very much.